All right, let's take a look at the spinal cord. And so specifically, we're looking at the fifth cervical vertebra here. And so we're going to go over all of the features that are identified on this model. Number one, though, you always have to take a look at what anterior and posterior are on the spinal cord, because the spinal cord is essentially a cylinder that we've taken a cross-section of. And so when you're looking at it really, really close, sometimes you can't tell anterior from posterior, and that's going to really hurt you because a lot of these terms are actually quite simple. They're just the anterior horn or the posterior horn, and so they're easy as long as you know anterior from posterior. So first, before we get into the details, let's take a look and make sure we know the key features to look at to know what the back of the spinal cord is versus what the front of the spinal cord is. So for posterior spinal cord, if you have the bone in place like this, you can easily take a look at the spinous process back here and the body of the cervical vertebra here. That will easily tell you anterior from posterior, just remembering that the spinous processes are on the back, right? You can feel them if you reach around to your back. You can feel the spinous processes of your fifth cervical vertebra right now. So that's going to tell you when the bone is in place. So it's pretty easy, basically, when the bone is in place. But there's a couple other models, or maybe you'll have a representation that leaves the bone out, and you're actually only up close like this. In this case, under a microscope or on a model, you're always going to be able to pick out a region of the gray matter here and here. It's actually called the posterior or dorsal horn. That dorsal horn actually is connecting to the sides of the spinal cord here, whereas if you notice the ventral or anterior horns here, they don't really connect. And so they're much more blunt, they're not as sharp, and they don't connect on the ventral or anterior side, or the front side of the spinal cord. But back here, they do connect. And so what you're always going to look for, even when you're this close, is go ahead and look for the gray matter region, that dorsal horn, which is much more pointy, and it actually connects to the posterior surface of the spinal cord. So that'll keep you oriented whenever you're looking at the spinal cord. So let's back up just a little bit more. So now we're going to take a look at those structures, some of which I just mentioned within the spinal cord itself. So let's go ahead and look in closely. We're going to start from the center, and we're going to move our way out. So right in the dead center of the spinal cord is what's called the central canal that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. That central canal is actually surrounded by a gray mattered region called the commissure, or the gray commissure specifically. So a commissure is something that connects different sides of the nervous system. You're going to see them in the brain, but you also see them right here in the spinal cord. So gray, whenever we're saying gray, that's actually referring to the fact that when you look at spinal cord tissue, the areas that have cell bodies of neurons are actually a little bit darker. And so in this model, it's more brown. So our gray matter, this may be confusing. Why are we calling it gray? Well, the artist has just chosen to make it look brown because it is a little bit brown as well. And so gray matter is all in brown right here. Gray, commissure, central canal. And we already talked about the horns a little bit. Here's the dorsal or posterior horns, here and here. Lateral horns, here and here. And ventral or anterior horns, here and here. And so just to let you know, your key has an error on it for, I believe, 37, 36, and 38 as well. It says column when it should say horn. So there's an error on your key there. So that's it for really the gray matter structures here. The other structures that are kind of important for the spinal cord are two cracks that are in the spinal cord itself. There's one here and there's one here. So this crack is a very subtle crack. This crack is a really deep crack. So if we use our anatomical terminology, there are a couple terms we use to describe cracks. There was a sulcus, and a sulcus is a relatively subtle, small crack, whereas a fissure is a big fissure, a big crack. And so those two terms basically mean there's a crack in something, but the fissure is a term used for the bigger ones, and sulcus is the one used for the smaller ones. So if we just apply that to what we're seeing here, this is a much more subtle little crack right here. So this is our sulcus, and this is our fissure up here, a much bigger crack. Now, we don't just call them the sulcus or the fissure. We got to put a directional term on them. So this is the posterior median fissure. Remember, take a look at those dorsal horns or posterior horns to tell you the posterior side. And then anterior median fissure is right there on the anterior side. And remember, a fissure is much larger, and this is a much larger deviation, larger crack. All right, so now let's take a look at the connective tissue structures, because the connective tissue structures can be a little bit confusing on this model. So let's sort those out right now. So remember, central nervous system structures are going to have arachnoid motor. Sorry, let me change the order of how I say this. I'm always going to say these connective tissue structures in order, from the outside to the inside. Dura mater, arachnoid motor, and pia mater. So I remember it as DAP or DAP. So from the outside, dura mater is actually covering, if we zoom out just a little bit, we can see that there's connective tissue around this entire structure, including the nerves out here. And so it's it looks like a G, but I believe it's number 9 on your key. Yeah, the dura mater. That's your most exterior layer. So that is also around your brain, but it's continuous and down surrounding your spinal cord here as well. And then down here, that most exterior layer, that is your dura mater. Let me get a little bit closer so there's no confusion here. So dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, actually like spandex around the spinal cord. Pia mater the whole way. It even goes into that anterior median fissure right there. So those are your 3 connective tissue components there. Now, there's a couple of different spaces that you probably need to know about. One is called the epidural space, so starting from the outside. That's this whole cavity here. Epi means on top of or upon, technically. And so epidural is just a space actually outside of the dura mater itself. And then you have this subarachnoid space here, and sub means beneath or below. And so that's the space actually below the arachnoid mater, but above the pia mater. So it's that whole space right in here. I believe it's represented by number 13 on your key, and it's kind of obscured, but there's number 13 there to represent that. So you've got epidural, subarachnoid spaces that you can also see here. All right, so now let's take a look at some nerves and some neurons here from the outside. So you've got a couple roots. So you've got the ventral root and the dorsal root. Dorsal in the back, ventral in the front. Ventral carrying motor neurons, dorsal carrying sensory neurons. So back here and here. Those roots actually merge together eventually. And what they're going to do is they're going to merge together right around here. And that's when they form the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve doesn't actually begin until right here. And then if I zoom out, we can see it on the other side as well. So here and here. It's the dorsal and ventral roots that merge together to form the spinal nerves themselves. Now, before the sensory neuron, the motor neuron is pretty boring. It's one continuous axon right here. But the sensory neuron goes out the dorsal roots, goes into what's called the dorsal root ganglion, right here, represented by number 19. It's in connective tissue right over here, but they're both there. And let's take a look at the other the structures after the actual spinal nerve. So spinal nerves here. And then the spinal nerve immediately branches into 2 branches. It branches into a anterior ramus and a posterior ramus, which is a little obscured here. Now, ramus just means bridge or connection. So again, this is where the directional terms are so important. So if you can just remember that they're called a ramus because they're connected to things. They're forming a connection from the spinal nerve to other nerves. But more importantly, the directional term. This is the anterior ramus because you can see this is the anterior side, and posterior ramus is back here. Now don't confuse that with this. This is the rami communicantes. This connects the anterior ramus to the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is what we're staring down at here. If you take a slightly different perspective, if you kind of crouch down a little bit and look at the model, you'll see that this is it's something that's running up and down, and this is the sympathetic chain ganglia, a sympathetic chain ganglion, or plural would be the sympathetic chain ganglia, which are connected to the anterior ramus via the rami communicantes right there. So a lot of little things going on there, so run over that again and make sure you kind of understand those different connections. And I think that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about. Let me step back and make sure I didn't forget anything. let's see, I don't think, usually we're referring to these during the blood vessel week, but these are your vertebral arteries, which are running in the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. And I think that that's it. All right.